Fire is a good thing, as in power when controlled. However, fire nor power is a good thing when uncontrolled. In part 1 of our series, we discovered that all leaders are not good leaders and that you have to measure their effectiveness based on their impact to their followers. Niccolo Machiavelli is noted for his writings about power and the need for those in control to maintain power at all costs. He posited that authority does not necessarily lead to a leader having power, suggesting that being good or honest doesn't make a difference when dealing with the concept of leadership and power. If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared. Vlad the Impaler, during his reign of terror, wanted to quell any attempts at insurrection. He was noted to have invited guests to a dinner where he would order them to be stabbed and have their bodies impaled on stakes. He also became upset when a group of visitors refused to remove their turbans, citing religious reasons. He ordered to have their turbans nailed to their skulls. I'm not interested in preserving the status quo. I want to overthrow it. In January of 2021, a mob of President Trump loyalists converged on the White House in hopes of changing the trajectory of democracy. They had been fueled by the delusional rantings of a president who had lost his re-election bid. Thinking they could overturn the election by storming the Capitol while the electoral votes were being counted, America watched in horror as thousands of people stormed the Capitol in defense of their leader, who was nowhere to be found. For in truth, there is no sure way of holding other than by destroying. Saddam Hussein is known for human rights violations against his own people. It is known that he refused to allow human rights monitors from the United Nations to enter his country. Reports of women being assaulted while in Iraqi custody were common. Saddam believed that prostitution was punishable by death, and he ordered the death of a mother whose sons had defected. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. Adolf Hitler is credited as being the most notorious dictator of the 20th century. Under his reign, he directed the death of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims simply because he convinced his people that their race was superior to others and that therefore they should be exterminated. His goal was the genocide of the Jewish people. He almost succeeded. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Idi Amin, the former president of Uganda, was responsible for the massacre of over 300,000 civilians during his reign. He also bragged about being a cannibal, saying human flesh was not for him because it was too salty. He who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command. Kim Jong-un, the current ruler of North Korea, had his uncle executed. Since taking power, he has directed the increase of nuclear capability in Korea. This threatens not only his own people, but the rest of the world. And here comes in the question whether it is better to be loved rather than feared, or feared rather than loved. It might perhaps be answered that we should wish to be both. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another segment of Tabernacle Talks. And last week, we certainly heard the survivor story about the Jonestown massacre. But this week, we are going to be looking at the research behind the events that took place. And as my guest today, we have Dr. Wendy M. Edmonds, and she has done some phenomenal research. In fact, she was the first person to actually say, let me do focus groups and research with the survivors of the Jonestown incident. So welcome to Tabernacle Talks, Wendy.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle. I appreciate you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share about my research. Thank you for having me. I feel honored.
Well, you know what? You talk about intoxicated followership, and certainly I'm going to make sure that the audience knows how to get that book. I've actually downloaded it, and I'm going to tell everybody it is a real eye-opening treat, even for current leadership theory. If some of you are trying to figure out some of the dynamics within your group or even what's going on in your boss's head, you need to get this book because it's very relevant. It's not just about what happened in Jonestown. It really focuses on leaders and followers and how that symbiotic relationship goes. So we're privileged to have you. What do you want us to know about you, Dr. Edmonds? I know what I know, but what do you want our audience to know about you?
I am a professor in Bowie State University, which is the oldest historically Black college and university in the state of Maryland. And I absolutely enjoy my research. My research focuses on toxic followership. So we often hear about leaders, leadership styles, and one doesn't go without the other. But my interest is really toxic followership.
Wonderful. And that's why I thought it was so important that we had you on the show, because you actually have interviewed the survivors from Jonestown. And let's just kind of jump into the question, because I always have questions. What before Jonestown, there was the People's Temple. And I think many of our audience that tuned in last week, they learned that. But can you explain to our audience from your purview, what was the People's Temple?
So the People's Temple, I want to go back to how that got started with Jim Jones back in 1954, actually started a church called the Wings of Deliverance. And from there, a couple of years later, he changed the name of the church because Jim Jones had 2 degrees, one from Indiana University and one from Butler University. So he was this well-respected young man in the community. He wanted something different as it related to church. So in 1954, he created the Wings of Deliverance, or Community Unity, I'm sorry, and then Wings of Deliverance 2 years later. His congregation began to grow, and he moved his church to Redwood, California, Redwood Valley. And that's where it grew through the 1970s, all the way to membership of close to 5,000. And so today we call that what? A mega church. So that was the mega church of the day.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So he would have gotten a lot of attention having a group that size in the 70s, because that was not commonplace in the 70s to have the mega churches that we see today. So what we know about him, we have to go back to 1978 when all this began to unravel. Did it begin to unravel then, or did it begin to unravel earlier than that? Because I know in your book you mentioned about his childhood. Where do we begin to see maybe the unraveling of this leadership personality?
Where it was public was when it starts along the way. So I always say it's progressive. This behavior is progressive, but they began to conduct an investigation on Jim Jones. Now, he had the largest church in California, but they were hearing things that weren't right. You know, there was accusations of molestation. There was accusations that money was not being handled properly. And so he became really afraid when the investigation started. The newspaper articles were being written about him and members of the church. And so he then decided to move the church out of California.
Wow. So he did that to kind of get away from the scrutiny that he was beginning to receive, not just from maybe some of the defected members, but he was beginning to feel that from a bigger audience, which was the public.
He held a position in California. And so that position put him in the realm of being with other politicians, right? So he began to get this positional power, and that really put him in the limelight as being this person who is very well respected. He has this church, the church has the largest membership. And so it's hard for people to look at someone who was very prominent as someone who has these bad characteristics as well. So almost to the point of being unbelievable, right?
Wow. Because it would be such a dichotomy to the person that he wanted you to believe that he was.
Right.
Okay, so let's move to, if we're talking about the 70s, late 70s when this was happening, we're still grappling with systemic racism now. And we obviously know the environment was no different back in 1978. And during my research, I found that about 80% of the individuals who joined Jim Jones in Guyana were African American. How was he able to accomplish this? That you're looking at all these African American people following this white man out of the country. That just seems so counterintuitive based off of the times. What did you find allowed them to do that, or motivated them to do that?
So let's go back and talk about what toxic followership is. Okay. Toxic followership, and I always want to define what that is in the context that I'm speaking about it.
Okay.
Because there's not one definition of toxic followership. It's kind of like leadership, right? There's, depending on where you're reading, it has to be defined. But this is specific to understanding that, or defined as a trusted individual that manipulates the mindset of others through manipulative tactics. And it really has those who are under that sort of mind control, under the belief that they will act and behave just like that toxic leader, even to the point of giving up their life. So they behave like that toxic leader. They speak in the same manner, and they purport the same beliefs and values that they do. So that's the dangerous part. When you look at the African American community, he was a predator. Jim Jones was a predator. So he preyed specifically, as one of the participants said, he preyed on African Americans because of their faith in God, because of their loyalty to God, and the commitment to going to church.
Wow.
Now, what's interesting about that is that we know as a people what that means.
Yes.
Right, because
yes,
when we speak about church, we're not saying the church. It's the Black church. And the Black church has a different meaning. The Black church is the very first ownership of land that we had in this country. So we have been or been brought to this country, but we weren't able to bring our culture. Church allowed us to express ourselves. Church allowed us to when we were ignored, when we were called outside of our names, in every aspect of where we were outside of church. When we got to church, we were Sister Michelle.
Yes, we were. And we were very forgiving. You're right.
Yes.
Very forgiving. So
Yeah.
he knew that. He knew, because even today, when you look at the statistics of church membership declining, all of those metrics still say Black America still goes to church, and we still value that. It's so ingrained in us culturally and just a part of our community that you're right. He sensed that, he knew that, and he picked African Americans because he knew of the relationship with the church.
And
Here,
he exploited that. He exploited the very thing that we treasure. And did so in a very methodical way. So consider this. What you see is that Maslow always says, our basic needs must be met. So here is Jim Jones saying, you don't need your house. I provide housing for you. Hence the communal lifestyle. You don't need anything. I provide food. I provide clothes. Everything that you need from meeting those basic needs, he was able to provide that. And so this whole sense of this sacrificial discipleship, which is what he wanted from them, he never displayed. So he never gave up anything. We know from the word sacrifice means that you're giving, right? You're giving up something of value, something that's very near and dear to you. He never did. But he did require his members to give up their homes, their cars, their paychecks, everything for him.
what I find interesting, and hopefully in the focus groups, maybe this came out, the United States response to what was happening. You have all these Black people liquidating their assets, just kind of leaving the country. And it almost seems like nobody noticed. Do you find that profound? I mean, that's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, and it's almost, so my laughter isn't out of insensitivity, it's just that it is my belief that African Americans leaving in large numbers from this country to go anywhere back then was never an issue of interest, and right now would never be an issue of interest.
And going to South America, that just blows my mind that he was able to not only get them to follow him, but get him to leave the country. So
Well,
what did you find?
Okay.
If you can expound on that, please do.
Yeah, part of that is because he had created this agricultural project, is what he called it. And that actually started while they were in the States.
Okay.
And this belief in, we are going to be self-sufficient. We don't need the government. We're going to be self-sufficient. And so by the time he says, hey, I found the perfect location
Middle of the jungle.
in the middle of the jungle, almost 3,000 acres of rainforest. They were able, which says a lot about the members of the church, they were able to carve out a community in the middle of the jungle.
Wow.
And let's not be misled that he lured them over. Some people left for different reasons, some by force. So all of the stories are different. So the richness of the focus group, which is what I was so happy to have been able to do, is that when they got together over this period of time to share the stories and in my presence, the one thing that I will say that amazed me is that they were able to put pieces of their life that was missing together. That was the beauty. So there were people in the room that hadn't seen each other in 30-some years.
Wow.
And so as they're telling stories, I didn't know that happened. Or they were wondering about people or family members where someone saw something. They were able to put together some pieces of their life that they always wanted to know. And so that was the richness of having the focus group that cannot be duplicated. And you don't get that in individual interviews. And so that was amazing for me as a researcher. That was amazing to really see that. And even in conducting the research, there were times where it was so important to let the moments take place that I couldn't follow up with the next question. You know how researchers are.
Yes, we go in that hole and we
Yeah.
can't come out. But you actually wanted to understand the dynamic. You didn't look at them saying, you know, I'm going to exploit them like many media outlets and many individuals did, passing judgment. You really tried to understand the dynamics that occur between the leaders and the followers. And I think it just culminated into an exceptional piece of research and literary genius. So I would certainly tell people to pick up your book, because it is very impactful and telling about how leadership behaviors can become very controlling over a period of time, and how interesting the groups acquiesce. You know, because I always thought, you know, the groups form, storm, and then
they norm.
So, but in this case, the norming became very toxic.
Oh, it did. And we have to remember that we see things, but we don't know quite what it's called. We know it's not right, but at that very moment, you have the choice to follow that toxic behavior or stand up to it in a very courageous way and not acquiesce to that.
Now, Dr. Edmonds, in my research, I've found that, you know, over 900 people died. The FBI reports that. And they also report there were survivors. And there was a combination of people who were actually at Jonestown and people who were in the city who were members of Jonestown who ended up surviving. When you spoke to those survivors, did they talk about that survivor guilt? And even though you've talked to them years later, are they still experiencing that? Will they always experience that?
Yes, they did speak about that. And more importantly is that this country did not do a very good job of helping them deal with the trauma that was experienced. And so that's why they're still having, although they have learned to live with the trauma that they experienced, there's still challenges. There are still challenges. And, you know, so I always had this compassion, because my mom said when it happened and I was in high school, she told me, she said, you were so depressed. Like, I didn't understand, how did this happen? And why would anybody do that? And as an adult, I grew up with that question still unanswered. So to have the opportunity to sit with the survivors and have them share their stories and leave me with the requirement that, hey, guess what? We are doing this because we want you to share this so that it doesn't happen again, so that people will understand. This country did not care very much about what happened. It didn't happen on American soil. So there's this struggle over, well, who's really responsible? What are we going to do with them? So some of them, 87, survived, but what about the rest of the bodies? So there are places that are saying, not here. Nope, not here. No, we're not going to have them here.
Wow.
So that's why there's that mass grave.
And you know, I didn't know about that until, I don't think a lot was written about that. I think you saw the media, the press of airlifting bodies. That's what you saw. You never saw or understood, no, there was a mass grave for those
Right.
individuals.
And to some extent, when we look at the numbers, 75% of those who perished that day were African Americans. 1/3 were children. So we go, it's 2021, and there's so much that's unknown. And we continue to focus on the leader. This is not about Jim Jones alone. What about all of the wonderful people who followed a project under the guise of a church, where you get to the jungle, there's one way in and no way out, with a man who is deranged, who practices white night, meaning every time you get into any kind of sleep after working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, everybody has to gather when they hear the siren, to gather to hear him. So sleep deprived, nutrition deprived, that's how he was able to exploit them. That's not what church does.
No, and all under the guise of religion. And I think we do still see that religion has been used throughout history, I think, to propagate agendas that aren't necessarily meaningful for all mankind. And so when you see something like this happen and you think all under the guise of religion, at what point did it really stop being a church? Because he clearly was more socialist, more Marxist in his thinking and his thought processes. I'm not sure when people start saying, is this really a church?
So what the participants say is that from my study is that was no longer an issue. It didn't matter anymore, right? Because we are now connected as family. All of these wonderful people who are members of the church, it didn't matter what color. We were the rainbow family, the rainbow church. And we wanted to complete the project. No one had ever done that before. We're going to do this thing. So the motivation came from the social identity with the members, not with Jim Jones. So it's kind of like you go to work, right? So you go to work and every day the boss has a nasty attitude. And everybody's like, that's just who he is. That's just who she is. That's just the way it is. And as though you need to deal with this. And it progresses and progresses, and you just continue to go about doing your work. But this thing about that boss continues.